So thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today. I feel very honored. I understand it's a day of debate, but also a day of celebration, and it's nice to join you on that day of celebration. That said, I was asked to speak on Galatlit Greenlandic decolonization in a global context, which I'm happy to do. But, and there's something I need to get off my chest right away. I do not speak Galatlisut. I've not been to Galatlit Nunat, and my Danish is not so good. So, in other words, I felt like I'm a more or less useless person in this conversation. So I was trying to think, what can I do that is useful, right? And I decided that what I would do is speak about comparative colonialisms. So I come from South Africa, and I do research. I'm based at Aarhus University now, but I do research on colonial and decolonial situations in different parts of the world. And I thought what I would do is share my understanding and experience of those situations. And I would also share an historical moment, which was very, very formative for me, which was the moment of decolonization in South Africa, which is around 1990, 1994, right? Which is a beautiful story that we all know. And I was lucky enough to be a young person at that time, and in some ways to be a part of that story. So I thought I would share that and share my understandings of of what decolonization means, and maybe what a decolonial moment might look like. And to help us along, I've put all the scary words in green, and I'm hoping that you will ask me questions about all of these things as we go. Okay? So I feel like I'm an outsider in some ways. I bring an outsider perspective. I don't want to comment in particular on the historical or contemporary relationship between Greenland and Denmark. I mean, I have thoughts, but it's also not my place to just push those thoughts out. But I'm hoping that bringing an outsider perspective also maybe opens things up a little bit, you know, for the debate here. A famous South African that we all know, of course. And there's another famous South African, actually. Can anybody tell me who the figure is with his arm spread? It's Tutu, yeah, of course. Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Iconic moments, iconic images coming from that decolonial moment in South Africa. So to begin, what is colonialism? What do we mean by colonialism? It's multidimensional, and I'll say more about that, but it has many different dimensions. I've talked a little bit already about the idea of comparative colonialisms. So when we look at colonial and decolonial situations around the world, there are many similarities between them. And one can almost say that there's a kind of a colonizer playbook that colonizers kind of, you know, draw ideas from. And we see that actually as we go from situation to situation, and we see the same kinds of practices and ideas and relationships being manifested in the relationship between colonizer and colonized. The first dimension, which is the one that we all know, and we probably know this best, is the political dimension. And here the idea is sovereignty, right? And sovereignty means power over. So the idea is a country or a people or a territory has power over another country or people or territory. And that notion of sovereignty, it can be absolute sovereignty or it can be partial sovereignty. So there are also arrangements around self-government or home rule, or, you know, I mean, some power is given, but the majority of power is held. And I think what we understand as well is that political power over creates the conditions for other kinds of power over. And what are those? So really important as well is the economic dimension of colonialism. And often this is based on exploitation or extraction. Flows of wealth from a colonized people or territory going to the colonizer. And when we look at many European nations, for example, historically speaking, the wealth of those nations is often built on extraction from colonized territories. And many nations have a kind of a golden age, right? And often that golden age wealth is based on colonial extraction. The one that always comes to mind for me is the Netherlands, where I've been based for a while and done some work. And the Dutch golden age, you know, is based partly on wealth extracted from my own country, South Africa. What are the other dimensions? There's a social dimension of colonialism, which is really important. And this is a division between the colonizer and the colonized. And often in settler colonial situations, a colonized people are often regarded as a kind of a subject people or as second-class citizens in their own country. This was definitely the case in South Africa, which is it's a settler colonial setup. And as well, in terms of social relations, we can think about forms of racism and forms of paternalism. Racism exists on a spectrum, from hard racism to paternalism, which is on the softer end, and that's often the idea, we're doing this for your own good, right? You might not like this, but actually it's for your own good. Right, that's the idea with paternalism. And then cultural and epistemic dimensions of colonial rule. Epistemic is a scary word. It just means knowledge, right? So culture becomes colonized and knowledge becomes colonized. And what does that mean? It means that local or indigenous cultural formations are often devalued. Often there's an emphasis on replacing those with the culture of the colonizer. And the same with knowledge, ideas about the world. Often those are replaced with other forms of knowledge. And then as well as part of this, often there's an emphasis on assimilation. So you need, if you're a local or indigenous person, if you're a colonized person, then you need to assimilate to the dominant culture, to the colonizer culture. And there's a huge emphasis on that. And that's often framed in terms of sort of the road to modernization. You know, if you want to get on board with modernization, you need to assimilate in that way. And then in many colonial situations as well, there's a human or life dimension. And sometimes this is really the most, let us say, a very, very disturbing dimension of this relationship. This includes, in many situations, I'm thinking in particular of many colonial situations in Africa, for example, the part of the world that I study. It includes colonial genocides. It includes interventions into women's reproductive health. It includes the systematic devaluing of black and brown life. So here the idea is white life is sacred, black and brown life is essentially disposable, right? And we can think about whether this kind of echoes in the world now, right? The world that we know, which is such a disturbing and in many ways dismaying world that we occupy right now, isn't it? And then like fancy words from theory, which we can kind of ignore. Michel Foucault, French post-structuralist philosopher, talking about biopolitics, right? The way in which power is written into the body, and the way in which the control of bodies becomes a key aspect of colonial rule. And then Achille Mbembe, Cameroonian philosopher, talking about necropolitics, necro to do with death. So the way in which there's a kind of logic of deathliness, if you will, that is written into political logics. Really, really disturbing aspects of. So thinking about South Africa in particular, so you'll know about apartheid rule as a particular form of colonial rule, and what were some of the aspects of apartheid rule. Forced removals and social engineering were a big part of it, and we can read on the slide. Up to 4 million people were forcibly removed, right? And often this was done in the name of sort of rationalization and modernization. Like we need to take people from their homes and put them into, into sort of these small, more regulated setups like this. This is Soweto Township in its early days, right? And some of you will have heard of Soweto, the sort of big, iconic township outside of Johannesburg. So people were taken from all over and then kind of settled here. As well, in South Africa, there was segregated education, like separate educations. White kids got like a kind of premium education, black and brown kids not so much. And you can read here about something called the Bantu Education Act, which sort of codified that in a way. There was the suppression of indigenous languages in South Africa, so school kids, for example, had to be taught in the colonizer language, which in this case was Afrikaans, a version of Dutch, like a creolized form of Dutch. And this is the 1976 Soweto school children's uprising. It's when school kids in Soweto took to the streets to protest against their inferior education and against the idea that they should be educated in Afrikaans. And interestingly, I mean, they took on the state, right? And these were kids. I mean, some of them were like 12, 13 years old. And they won. Can you believe it? So that was the end of forced education in Afrikaans. Extraordinary sort of victory there. So so much for colonization. I mean, I don't think there's anything new in what I'm telling you, right? I'm just sort of like laying out the sort of the dimensions of colonialism. So what is decolonization? It's also multidimensional. So there are also political, economic, cultural, epistemic, social, etc. aspects to this. Many parts of the world, we see what we could think of as a kind of incomplete decolonization process, where there is political autonomy or sovereignty, but economic dependency, for example. And often those are referred to as neo-colonial situations. And I think when we look across, for example, parts of Africa, parts of South America, we see these neo-colonial situations, these relationships of economic dependency that carry on. And then I think within this, there's some really interesting questions to ask around what does it mean to decolonize culture, and what does it mean to decolonize knowledge, right? And you know, I think this is where we can start getting sort of creative and thoughtful in a way. So within the anti-colonial literature in Africa, there's a super interesting conversation around decolonizing the mind. It's a conversation that was begun in the 1960s, which was the sort of the high point of African decolonization. A lot of the former British colonies, for example, won independence in that period, some of the French colonies and so on. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a Kenyan writer, and Steve Biko is a South African writer and political activist. And these are like fabulous books, like key books. And then we have the whole aspect of decolonizing knowledge. So I put this in, it's a little bit of a sort of a twisty subject to get into, but I see lots of students, university students in the audience. And this will have special relevance for you, right? Because these discussions and debates around what does it mean to decolonize, for example, the curriculum, have a lot of traction right now globally in universities around the world. Often we are taught to think that history works in terms of you have a thing, right? And there's something that becomes before the thing, like the pre-colonial, and then the colonial, and then the thing that comes afterwards, the post-colonial. And that there's sort of breaks between them. And that you move in a linear relationship across them. Actually, I think, and many people argue, decolonization begins as soon as colonization begins. In other words, we don't have to think of decolonization as something that lies in the future, right? It's not like we have to wait for permission. It's not like we have to achieve sovereignty before we begin the work of decolonization. There are always forms of resistance. From the moment that colonization happens, resistance also happens. And then, in particular, we can think about the way in which there are resistant projects in the realm of culture and knowledge, which happen all the way through. There's a special importance, I think, that we can place on culture and the arts, precisely because these are the ways in which we can begin to imagine decolonial futures. You know, that's what the arts allow us to do. That's why they're so valuable in our societies. They put us in mind of imagining different futures. And those different futures are sometimes so important, aren't they, to imagine. So another aspect of decolonization is around the importance of indigenous languages and mother tongue languages and mother tongue education. And there's the whole question of language rights, which becomes so important. So South Africa, now post-apartheid South Africa, has 11 official languages. Those are the official languages of South Africa, which means that every government document gets translated into 11 languages. Can you believe it? Yeah. And it's beautiful. It's like a big, I don't know, symphony of different languages. And you find your place within that. Instead of just saying, okay, there's only one language and everyone has to. So it works, right? Then as well as part of the decolonization process, there's often a conversation around reparations and restitution. And you can read the definitions of those terms there. Reparations can be financial, like a payment of money, but really importantly, they also encompass the return of cultural heritage. My own field, I'm trained as an archaeologist, of all things, and my own field is heritage studies and archaeology, and within that field, there's a lot of conversation around the restitution of cultural property, the return of cultural property, and as part of that as well, the return of the ancestors, human remains. And this becomes like so important in the whole decolonization moment. And you'll know, if you watch the press, you'll know that in the last 5 years, I want to say, this has become like a huge, huge topic of debate globally. It's like really a big thing globally. And museums around the world and universities around the world are busy restituting cultural property. And having a lot of kind of interesting discussions around how you do this. I was in South Africa 10 days ago listening to Victoria Gibbon speak, that person. And she was talking about the restitution process in relation to human remains in South Africa. And then also as part of the decolonization process, there's often a reassessment of monuments and memorials. I mean, this again is something that has taken off globally in the last 10 years or so. This is an image from the student-led social movement at the University of Cape Town called Rhodes Must Fall, which campaigned for the removal of the campus, the university campus, of this statue that you see, which was a statue of Cecil John Rhodes, the British imperialist. And it was situated right at the pedestrian entrance to the campus. And there were all sorts of discussions. Should we keep it? Should it go? What do we do with this thing? Should we cover it? Should we modify it? And in the end, the decision was made, let's remove it, right? And these discussions can be very generative, I think. I don't think there's a single answer. Should it go? Should it stay? But the discussion itself becomes very generative. Another aspect of the contemporary world that we can think about, which I think is so important and so interesting as part of the decolonial process, is the idea of indigenous solidarity. So indigenous movements around the world offer solidarity and support for one another. There are wonderful interlinkings and networks that are happening. There's a lot of interesting discussion taking place and a lot of support that happens there. And then something else, and here I will break my rule about not commenting on Denmark. I'll make a very small comment, which is like comes with a lot of, I would say a lot of care, even love into the space, and it's about the importance of having difficult conversations, and sometimes that means you have to be really brave, right? And you have to talk about all of the things that you don't want to talk about, or the things that make you feel uncomfortable. And here again, I want to refer back to my own kind of history and experience and the place that I come from. South Africa had this wonderful institution that they made in 1996 as part of the negotiated settlement. So the negotiation process ran from 1990 to 1994. April 94 was the first democratic elections, and then here. We're in April 96, 2 years later, the first hearing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this allowed people to come together and have difficult conversations. And these conversations were often the most difficult possible conversations because they were opening up to human rights abuses, and the conversations were often between perpetrators and victims. right? I mean, can you imagine, like, that scenario? And there was no model to work from. We've got used to the idea of truth and reconciliation commissions now, but back at this time there was no particular model. So it was partly drawing on clerical or Christian traditions of the confessional. So that's why Archbishop Desmond Tutu is there. And then civic society organizations were really important in this moment. And then as well, it was also a little bit like a psychoanalytic moment, like the therapist's couch, right? Because it was meant to be healing. So all of those things went into the mix. But that thing of having difficult conversations, I think, becomes so important in terms of moving into the future and dealing with difficult pasts. If you keep a lid on those conversations, it's very difficult to move forward, right? And it's difficult to get beyond a kind of mistrust. I wanted to say something about the rhythm of history, right? And here the idea is this. Do you recognize, does anyone recognize this photograph? If you do, you're really good. But let's see. It's like a pop quiz. Let's see. Can we recognize that person there? It's Mandela, right? And then this joyous crowd over here. Do we want to think about what this might be? So Mandela was held in prison for 27 years. And then the rumor emerged that he might be released. And no one knew if this was just propaganda, right? Or misinformation. But people began to converge here in Cape Town on the Grand Parade. 500,000 people converged. This was what? It was the 11th of February 1990. There was chaos. The police arrived. They started shooting around the edges of the crowd. ANC youth, they're called the Young Lions, started burning down buildings around the perimeter. People would appear on this balcony, struggle leaders, like all of the sort of the aristocracy of the struggle. And they would say, comrades, please be quiet. They were completely ignored. It was chaos. February is midsummer in Cape Town, so 35 degrees Celsius weather, smoke blowing over, gunshots, right? On the 500,000 people on the edge of, you think, oh, so this is not looking good, right? And then this tall, quiet man steps up in a grey suit, and he just stands there. He doesn't say a thing, and there's utter silence in the crowd, like that. Extraordinary, right? In English, you say you could hear a pin drop. Yeah, it was like that. Just like this commanding presence. So that's that moment. You know, and then he begins the speech, and it's one of the most boring speeches I think anybody's ever heard, because he begins by thanking everybody. He doesn't say, here I am, I will lead you to freedom. He just says, I would now like to thank, and he's got a long list of organizations, and they're solidarity organizations from all over the world. You know, the Swedish Solidarity Movement, the Danish Solidarity Movement, you know, the anti-apartheid movement in London. Goes like that, and in, like ritually sort of thanks everybody. Extraordinary moment. But what I want to say is this. 3 months before this moment, nobody in South Africa could imagine that this was going to happen. You know, I was living through this, and I remember it really clearly. You had no idea that apartheid was going to end. It seemed like it was with you forever. There was no like little chink of light anywhere. And then suddenly it changed, right? History turned on a hinge, like that. Boom. And suddenly we were into a new space and a new history. So what I wanted to say about the rhythm of history, we are taught to think of history as a kind of a gradual process, like this. Slow, cumulative, gradual. Actually, I think often the way things work is like that. Something happens and whoops, it turns like that. History turns on a hinge, on a moment. And suddenly you're in a new space. And the nice thing, I was in this crowd that day, and it's the one time I can say I felt history was being made in front of my eyes, right? Which you don't often witness. But I often think about that idea that you're in a historical moment and you can feel something is happening, that history is turning, and then you flip into a new and different kind of situation. And I suppose what I wanted to think about, and maybe we can chat about this later and in the questions. We live in such a disrupted moment right now, don't we? I mean, all of the rules seem to have gone out of the window. There are so many crises kind of stacking up. Things that we took for granted, we can't take for granted anymore. And I often wonder, I wonder whether we're living through another one of those moments where history kind of turns and flips. And I think that we may be. I'm not sure. But I'm really interested in maybe we can have this conversation. And then what do we flip into, right? What turn does that take? So the last slide, you can read it for yourself. The future is indigenous. Some really remarkable statistics and figures there. 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity on indigenous controlled land. Indigenous people hold tenure over roughly a quarter of the world's surface. Stuff around intact forests and critical mineral reserves. Perhaps underlining lots of the conversation that was happening this morning, right? And also underlining the importance of the conversations that are happening in this site, in the house right now. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much, Nick. I have gotten some questions, and I think it would make sense if we save them till the conversation with Nick, because there's some of these questions you can't answer.
Great. Thank you.
So yeah, that will be the next thing, and we have about 10 minutes. I will just send you off with one thought, because what's remarkable about this presentation, to me at least, is there's a tendency in Denmark to think of the Galatlit-Danish relationship as something very unique. It's very special, and our history is like nothing else. And then we have this presentation about extractivism, about language policies, about how schools were segregated, all of these things about restitution. And it just becomes very clear that our histories are so interconnected with the rest of the world, and that global perspective, I think, could be very useful in the future conversations Denmark and Galatlit-Nunaat are going to have. So yeah, think about that. Have a nice break. I'll see you all in 8 minutes.